everyone. Welcome to...
That's my dancing. I do that when the thieves go. I do that.
Getting your moves going.
It is catchy. I am enjoying it.
I love it.
So today, Catherine's going to lead us in the discussion, and in the briefing notes, it's very interesting, Catherine. Do we know what we think we know about what they knew when they knew it at Bosworth? The Stanleys, because they just come in at the end and decide, and then boom. Right. Anyway, so that's what Catherine's going to be. Yeah, Catherine's going to be delving into that myth.
Waiting for the coin toss of history. That's the Stanleys.
So we shall be seeing what the truth is.
Well, I think without further ado, I should disclaim before we start getting rude, shouldn't I? Hello, friends. Welcome to History After Dark. Of the many reasons we called it that, prime amongst them is this is a place where we can come to get our vulgarity out. 4-letter expletives, filth, innuendo, general depravity. This is the place. If you are in an open plan office with a judgmental boss, put a headphone in. If you are in a fruit and veg aisle, a doctor's waiting room, or perhaps in a car with a small child, we call this child Timmy. Timmy's a problem. There's the mug. Check it out. We have merch, in case you didn't know. Timmy's the sort of child that hears one depraved thing one time, locks it away in his mind palace, takes it to school with him, and then repeats it in front of his teacher, who in my head is Miss Honey. She, God love her, doesn't watch us. She's not like you disgusting reprobates. She's a good girl. So she's the first cardinal rule of History After Dark, which is if you don't know what it means, don't Google it. It's not for you. And that's fine. Not everything is for everybody. So she Googles it, obviously. And now she's in the fetal position, rocking back and forth, weeping and non-verbal, not good for a primary school teacher. You're up to school. Why does Timmy know this? And also, hand over your credit card because this needs therapy to get her upright and verbal again. No one needs that. Put a headphone in. After all that, it must be clear to you abundantly what is about to happen here. The potentialities of filth and swearing. So at no point should any one of you come into these comments, nor, God forbid, into our individual comments and say something along the lines of, I really enjoy History After Dark, but must you ladies swear so much? Where is the decorum? The decorum, mate, is up my arse. Don't go looking. I know what you want. Well, you want that comment pinned so that the rest of the commenters will see it and they will come in and they will humiliate you publicly because that's your kink. Kinky. And I won't kink shame you. They might. But what I will shame you for is looking to fulfill your kink with us without our consent. Because as you will no doubt see in the comments, our dear friend Tiffany, with her conglomerate of Brighton dominatrixes. Dominatrixes? Who knows? What is it? I think it's a whiplash of dominatrix. In the Brighton basements, with their wiped clean walls and their wiped clean clothes and their car batteries and their arse gnomes and their antifreeze and their Karcher pressure washers and everything your dirty little heart and gaping bumhole could desire. But for that, you pay your money and you get your choice. I'm a little bit offended by what I just said. Sweet Christ, I hope you're all adults, because if you aren't, it's too fucking late now. But this
like the initiation ceremony.
If you are grown-ups, you can do what you want when it comes to alcohol, but let's be abundantly clear. Oh, get it together. This is not, nor will it ever be an approved drinking game. This will never be legal advice. Please do not sue.
Drinking's less harmful than everything else you've suggested.
I'm not sure I can. Wow.
Oh, sorry.
That was
for anyone listening on the podcast, Catherine's got her reaction set up on a computer. So when
no, it
thought you did a thumbs up
to gaping bumhole.
So you didn't see because your head was in your hands. But it thought you did a thumbs up. So there was a visual thumbs up to
I would
Kat's
like to just point out
recommendations.
that is not anything that I'm into.
I am also going to point out that I have
as well.
I have noticed over weeks that my disclaimers, they are getting worse.
They are.
I'm showing off, honestly. I'm showing off.
Just tired and showing off.
I've got a 9-month-old. I'm shattered.
Therapy as Miss Honey at this rate. Oh, dear Lord.
Miss Honey is in therapy for something relatively mild
compared to what Philippa and I have to go through.
Yeah.
She's not going to one of Tiffany's basements yet.
Maybe that's what she needs. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll sort her right out.
That's sort of right.
Well, kill or cure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a fry up and a hangover. Well, anyway, back to people who possibly myth-related in history.
Yes, do it.
Who didn't probably have white clean clothes. But who knows? So the Stanleys. So I am here to talk today about the commonly held belief that no one, including Richard III and Henry Tudor, knew who the Stanleys were going to stand for at Bosworth until the last nanosecond. Everybody. So they do have a bit of a reputation for swapping sides during the Wars of the Roses, like hedging their bets. Where should we go? What are we going to do? Sometimes even one of them taking different sides in the same conflict to try and make sure that there was somebody on the right side of whatever mess was cracking off that day. So who were the Stanleys? So the Stanleys were an English noble family with a lot of notable members, including the Barons Audley and the Earls of Derby. So those are titles you might have come across. Most people know of them, though, because of their parts in the Wars of the Roses, and particularly because of their last-minute intervention at the Battle of Bosworth Field, which is, I think, mostly considered what swung the battle in Henry Tudor's favour, really, at the end of the day. So there are two main figures in the Stanley family that we see generally, really, and in the conflict itself. So this Sir William Stanley was the younger brother of Thomas Stanley, who we will come to in a moment. He was born in 1435, and they were Irish twins, I think, from what I can make out. He, like his brother, fought in a number of battles of the Wars of the Roses. And he and Thomas were the sons of Thomas Stanley. Who knew? People calling everybody the same name and it being Thomas, who was the first Baron Stanley, and he was the son of Sir John Stanley, who was the one who created the fortunes of the Stanleys. And in 1465, he married Joan, daughter of John Beaumont, first Viscount Beaumont. So you hear that's another name that comes up a lot, isn't it? They had 3 children, William, Joan, and Catherine. And his second wife, because his first wife died quite shortly after the birth of their last child, was Elizabeth Hopton. And they had a daughter called Jane. He was known as Sir William Stanley of Holt in Wrexham. Because of that's after one of the castles that Richard III gave him when Richard III liked him. And we often see Sir William, therefore, as a Yorkist in this period of civil war. He fought at Blore Heath, Towton, and Tewkesbury. So big battle, Towton, big battle, Tewkesbury. And he and his brother, Thomas, also helped to suppress Buckingham's rebellion against Richard III in 1483. So this is all very Yorkisty, isn't it? It's got a little bit of a Yorkist theme going on. So Thomas Stanley, the older one, was the first Earl of Derby, began his royal career in 1454 as a squire to Henry VI. So going back quite a lot. And obviously Henry VI was a Lancastrian king. And in August 1459, at the Battle of Blore Heath, which I mentioned his brother William had thought out for the Yorkists, Thomas was there with quite a large force, but he didn't commit and join the battle for either side, and it ended up being a Yorkist victory. So we don't know why he didn't make a commitment at that point. It's quite telling that before he'd been, telling's not quite the right word, but, he'd been sort of very much a Yorkist previously, but he had worked for Lancastrian king. He had an opportunity to step in at Blore Heath, but we don't know why he didn't. So looking at overall them being quite Yorkisty at this point, they had their first little fracas with Richard of Gloucester, who of course became Richard III. As all of these things are, it's a little bit complicated, but I've tried to like squish it down a little bit. But basically, Richard was in Wales on the order of his brother, basically being a complete dick to the Welsh. And whilst he was there, a rebellion erupted in Lincolnshire, and Edward ordered Richard to array the men of Gloucestershire and Hereford to sort of get a force together and to assist against this rebellion. So Richard headed north to Hornby Castle in Lancashire, which was the seat of a family called the Harringtons, who you might have heard of, but they're a little bit less well known. But they were big Yorkists. They were all about the House of York. And on the 25th of March, Edward makes a reference to a variance between Thomas Stanley and Harrington. And both the Stanley brothers,
Is this the Harrington that is Elizabeth I's godson? Is it the same family?
I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me because you do see a Harrington family in that period, don't you? And they didn't do anything naughty enough, I don't believe, to kind of get them all wiped out from significance that I'm aware of. So possibly, yeah.
Because he's the one who's supposed to have made the first flushing toilet, just as a side.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's quite the claim to fame, isn't it?
Sorry. I heard Harrington. I went, oh, lavatory.
Oh, toilet. Yeah.
Well, I'm not doing the genealogy, so I will leave you to do that if you really want to, but I wouldn't, to be honest. So yes, so there's a variance between Harrington and Stanley. I'm going to call the Stanley brothers Thomas and William, because I know we normally call people by their surnames or their titles, but just because otherwise you're saying Stanley and trying to say which one it is all of the time. So the Stanley brothers had been in a sort of a bit of a feud with the Harringtons for a little while. With regard to dominance in North Lancashire, Thomas and his eldest son were killed fighting for the Yorkists at the Battle of Wakefield. So again, we see Yorkists Wakefield, big significant battle in 1460. And the family inheritance, therefore, passed to John's young daughters and Elizabeth. And in 1468, the Stanleys gained the wardship of these two little girls, and so were able to take control of all the Harrington lands. I'm sure you saw where that delight was going. So William Stanley, and I'd say this was a pretty shitty move, if I'm being honest, locked the girls in his fortress at Holt. And they were then married off, of course, to members of the Stanley family. But the Harringtons, although they were supposed to give up everything, refused to give up Hornby. They stayed put. They weren't having any of it. And it seems, although I don't think that this has been proven, that Thomas Stanley and his retinue at the time were actually on their way to join Warwick the Kingmaker on the way to the battle that we mentioned just now. And they clashed with Richard and his men who were en route to meet William Stanley. So you can see a bit of like Stanleyness, or more standing against the Yorkists a little bit in the background here. And so they clashed with Richard and his men. And there is a poem called the Stanley poem, which is lovely, but we don't know, as with many of these things, exactly how accurate it is. But it says within this text that Stanley complained to the king about Richard. And Edward said he would rebuke Richard, who went to trial, sort of trial 3 days later. But Richard was properly fucked off, like, really? Really? And in the end, it came to nothing between them. Like, neither of them really got into any particular trouble with Edward. So we're not exactly sure what happened there, but on the 2nd of June in 1470, Thomas Stanley was issued a pardon for all offences committed by him before 11th May last. And that was probably referring to the support he'd given to the rebels in Lancashire. But this, of course, created an animosity between Richard and Stanley that never really went away. So this is where it's less Yorkist and it's starting to bubble underneath the surface of these two things. And the dispute between these two families raged on. The Harringtons were still in the castle many years later. They wouldn't leave. They just wouldn't fuck off until Edward stepped in June 1473, and he commissioned Richard to take everything that the Harringtons hadn't already been forced to hand over to the Stanleys. So you can imagine again, once again, now the Harringtons are, you know, really pissed off about this. And the Stanleys have got everything. So it's a victory for the Stanleys in this comparison, and fury for the Harringtons over what had happened. Then Stanley, tries insult to injury once again, falsely indicted the Harringtons and attempted to have them thrown in prison. And then Edward really did step in and went, no, this all belongs to the Harringtons. So they really treated the Harringtons really quite badly. The Stanleys did as well. But James and Robert Harrington, so the members who were the uncles of the two young heiresses that had been locked up, remained loyal to Richard. And they were still fighting for his name and his cause even after he was dead. So it's a bit like, all right, whatever. So in 1461, Thomas Stanley was made Chief Justice of Cheshire by Edward IV. But a few years later, you see him with Warwick. He sided with his brother-in-law, Warwick the Kingmaker, in the redemption, which is from the Latin re-ad aptur, meaning to fit back. So the Lancastrian restoration, basically, to put Henry VI back on the throne. And on the 9th of September 1470, Warwick, Clarence and Jasper Tudor landed in Devon with Warwick's army, because of course Warwick had been away having a chat with Margaret of Anjou, trying to sort of put the Lancastrians all back together, hadn't they? Which is, I'm sure most of you know, ended pathetically. They marched to Coventry, so bloody way. They met the Earl of Shrewsbury and John Neville and Thomas Stanley, who had switched allegiance to the Lancastrians, kind of in an official capacity by now, I think. Edward IV was trapped. He fled to King's Lynn, and then he went to Burgundy, where his sister, Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, was. In the end, the redemption was an epic fail. Edward came back to the throne, and I think really this time it was very decisive. He was very secure on the throne. And it seemed, therefore, we had a Yorkist on the throne. There was children coming into the mix. There weren't really any Lancastrians left. The Yorkists were pretty secure in their place on the throne and within the nobility and so on and so forth. But, ladies and gentlemen, in true Edward IV tradition of completely ignoring what's staring him in the face when it comes to people committing traitorous acts, after Warwick fell at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April, 1471, Edward makes Thomas steward of the king's household. And then in June 1472, he marries the fabulous Margaret Beaufort, who we all love very, very much. We all love her very, very much. And she is, of course, the mother of Henry Tudor. So now he is essentially, Stanley is now married to a Lancastrian as well. This marriage gave Margaret access to the king. It gave her a place at the royal court. And she seems to have fitted in. She wasn't creating any waves. And in fact, she successfully petitioned Edward for her son to be safely allowed to return to England. So, you know, all this, oh, she wanted her son to be king and all this. That's all bullshit. I think I mentioned that again. Anyway, you know, it really does seem that they were in a place where Margaret just wanted Henry back. People had accepted the the Yorkists on the throne and so on and so forth. So, yeah, so potential, no, this is a myth alert, this one. Margaret Beaufort was not a religious maniac who had her sights set on the throne for her son the nanosecond after she shoved him out. Okay, she was also accused of murdering the princes in the Tower, which I think is very silly, and it's not to be spoken of again.
Yeah.
Right. So we've talked about this in previous episodes. Edward IV went and died without any consideration to anyone or anything else, and left a big mess behind him. And pretty much everyone got caught up in this clusterfuck in one way or another. And Thomas was given the dubious honour of being one of the executors of Edward IV's will, which is a bit bizarre, bearing in mind, you know, he hadn't been being very Yorkie, and that was obviously a very price. So whether or not it's like try and get him back in the fold, make him included, you know, so he stays on the right side of this conflict. But he was also Thomas being very loyal to the new boy king, Edward V. So it all looks once again a little bit Yorkisty. However, Richard, he sort of stayed in his post at Richard's bequest when he came king. So he was a little bit reluctant to be really under sort of the thumb or the position, however you want to term it, of Richard III. So whilst he might still have was prepared to accept a little bit of loyalty to the new king and appreciate some of the stuff that Edward IV had done for him, he was very wary of Richard III, as were a lot of people. Don't come for me. But that seems to tell him perhaps a little bit something about his opinion of Richard and how Richard came to take the throne. But miraculously, despite his marriage to Margaret Beaufort, he managed to stay out of the rebellion in 1483, which was undertaken on behalf of Henry. And this would have been a really big risk to get involved either one way or the other. So to manage to wriggle out of that when you're in such a high position with such a high profile marriage is really quite impressive, and does seem to be a very Stanley thing to be able to do. It's just like, just wriggle out, not have to quite, you know, put everything on the line unless you really, really have to. Now, then he gets another really important post. So he's still in with the Yorkists at this time, at least to the Yorkists. He was made Constable of England. Now, he was probably very capable in terms of his ability to do this job, but actually, was it given to him so that they could keep an eye on him? Keep your enemies, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And it was around this same time, of course, because, you know, with Henry attempting to come across, Margaret Beaufort was now like, no, we're watching you with your naughty son. So he was given, or was able to take possession of his wife's estates and told basically to lock her up, keep her under lock and key. By taking everything from her, she didn't have any money and power, so she wasn't really in a position to try and get Henry to come back. And we know, of course, now that she was now at this point, she was looking for a way to try and get Henry to come back and to overthrow the king. But again, how much did people know that at the time? A lot of it was probably conjecture, but certainly Richard was extremely paranoid and suspicious, which I kind of get, but, you know. So it seems that there was, on Richard's behalf, some real suspicions growing of particularly Thomas, but both the Stanleys at this point, which of course pushes them away from the Yorkist cause. So on 13th of June 1483, most of the council met at Westminster to discuss the coronation of Edward V. However, key notable figures: Richard Buckingham, Lord Hastings, I'm sure I recognize all these names, Thomas Stanley, Margaret Beaufort, Bishop Mortimer and Bishop Rotherham were actually at the Tower. And we don't know why. We don't know why all these key people were there. But this is the occasion. It's reported by Thomas More, so you know, make that of what you will, that Richard left the meeting. I'm sure this is a story you've all heard. He left the meeting and returned banging on about treason. It's all treasonous, blah, blah, blah. Armed guards entered the room. There was a big scuffle to arrest Hastings, and Thomas Stanley actually got quite a bad cut, apparently. He was bleeding and everything like this. So, yeah, he was injured. That's the only one account. There's only one account of him sustaining this injury. But Hastings was dragged out and executed, as I'm sure you've all heard of before, without trial. And William Catesby, who presumably is an ancestor of the Catesbys associated with the gunpowder plot, if I had to hazard a guess, I'd say it would be, had gone apparently to Richard to tell him of the evil intentions of Hastings and some of the others. And Polydore Virgil, who ended up obviously being a chronicler for Henry VII, recorded that before Richard arrived in London, but then of course Polydore Virgil, we have to kind of decide which, you know, where he was leaning, don't we? Hastings was rallying round people who he believed stood for Edward V. And Grafton wrote that Thomas sent Hastings a trusty and secret messenger at midnight, saying they should ride away together. They're trying to get Hastings out. We know Hastings is involved in something against the Yorkist, against the king. And Stanley knows this, and he's in on this. So again, probably something a lot of you know. Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, self-styled King of England, landed in Milford Haven at Mill Bay on the 7th of August 1485. So they're there. It's time. They're going for it. They're marching up the country. They're going to find Richard and they're going to squish him. I don't think many people thought that that was how it was going to turn out, but you don't, it's not over till it's over. So the short version of this, because people have charted the whole thing, is that they marched towards the final destination of the battle, which we now know is sort of, well, we see the Battle of Bosworth Field, Leicestershire sort of way, and they collected men and support on their way. Richard did a similar thing coming from Nottingham. He was gathering support and they all came and met together. So morale was very shaky, which I think is understandable. And things were quite dicey in South Wales because it was firmly under Richard's control. So I mentioned earlier how he'd been twatting about treating the Welsh like shit. So a lot of South Wales was very firmly in control of Richard. So the Stanleys their forces were marching south and Tudors were kind of going up to meet them and having to be a bit careful around South Wales. However, when it comes to being more in north and around that area of Wales, William Stanley was, I can't pronounce this either, Justiciar of Anglesey. Yeah.
Justiciar.
Yeah, of Anglesey, Carmarthenshire and Merioneth. And Thomas had extensive lands in Cheshire and Lancashire. So to go north into Wales was a much safer place to be. And then the Stanleys are coming down. So they can all converge together. So here we see the Stanleys are coming to meet this Lancastrian force. Straight out. Both of them are there. It's not just one of them. What's the other one doing? Are they still with the king or anything like that? So Richard was at Nottingham Castle. The parking's terrible, if you're trying to visit there. You really have to plan ahead, just as a heads up. So he was on his way. Tudor was heading up that way, and Richard's like, oh, for fuck's sake. Mind you, he's coming. I need to get this sorted out once. Well, they're like, you do, Richard, to be fair, you do. So Richard's there planning all his next moves, trying to be all strategic. And, we know that he was a good battlefield words are hard. Technician. Oh, anyway, he was good. He was good in battle. He was very good at the tactics and everything like that. And again, he was getting his men to gather support. Now, at this time, Thomas Stanley should have been there, but he wasn't. His absence was very conspicuous. He kind of made some sort of excuses, and he'd requested early in 1485 to retire to his estates in Lancashire. And that to Richard was also very suspicious. Why did he need to go? Why was he not staying around court supporting the monarch and helping to hold court together? And the Ballad of Bosworth Field states that he was on his way to Nottingham, Thomas Stanley, but he fell sick at Manchester. Now, I've been to Manchester and I can understand that. The Croydon Chronicle said that Thomas claimed he had the sweat, which of course you'd want, if that was the case. Everyone would go, oh, no, you're right. You can.
No way.
Yeah. And then further stated that he and his son had decided to desert the king. So that's Thomas Stanley and Lord Strange, Baron Strange. And there's a document signed on the 18th of July, shows that Thomas and Strange were actually together in Lancashire. So they were there, they were heading in that direction, and it looks like that they were this force, they were sort of against Richard. So once again, Richard is very suspicious of these two people, and their actions and their absence from court really do suggest that this is not a Yorkist place that they are taking up. So Lord Strange, Thomas Stanley's son, tries to leave Nottingham, but was seized. I've seen a source that said that, and I can't remember what it was, but that Richard's suspicions of Stanley were growing and growing and growing, and he demanded that Lord Strange be sent to him so that he could be held hostage. Whereas this is saying he was already there and then they seized him. So, but either way, he was there. He was sort of seized and taken away. And he had his freedom removed from his father, so he couldn't get to his father or his uncle for support. But by having him as a hostage, however, it's like an insurance policy, isn't it? I've got your son, so if you do anything I don't like, I will execute your son. Fairly standard procedure, obviously. The Croydon Chronicle says that Richard, I'm not convinced about this, but Richard then said that he, William Stanley, and Sir John Savage, who is someone I don't know much about, those three had moved to support Tudor. He officially told Richard that Savage and himself and his uncle William were outwardly like denouncing the king and standing the Lancastrian cause for Henry Tudor. I don't know if he'd have done that, to be honest. It wouldn't have served him very well while he was incarcerated. So that seems a little bit suspect to me, but then I don't know. So if it was true, it was interesting that he just said me and my uncle, not my father. He didn't mention Thomas Stanley in that, so that's a little bit strange. Anyway, Strange then wrote to his father, Thomas, probably under duress, of course, to say, we're in really serious danger here. We need help. We need to come and get us. And you need to send aid to the king so that he will then let us live. And so we need to get as much support to the king as we can. And the Ballad of Bosworth Field says, Richard sent Thomas this message: yonder cometh Richmond over the flood, with merry allies out of fair country, bold men of bone and blood. The crown of England challengeth her. You must raise those that under you be, and all the power that yes may bring, or else the Lord strange you must never see. So Richard's like, yeah, I'm going to kill him, basically, unless you do what I want. So once again, this is not a man who's giving somebody cause to support the Yorkists. He's pushing away, it's pushing away. And at this time as well, Richard was meant to have said that John Savage and William Stanley were traitors, basically. He'd written them off as traitors. So on either the 20th or the 21st of August, so literally right before the Battle of Bosworth, there are reports of, very close to the site, 5 men being killed. I haven't bothered writing out all their names and stuff like that. But the ballad called The Song of Lady Bessie and the Ballad of Bosworth Field both describe a scene where they suggest an advanced guard, because everyone was heading to that spot for the final battle, an advanced guard from Richard's army had a clash with some of Stanley's men at a little place called Atherstone. So again, we've got Yorkist versus Lancaster, and it's Stanley's men at Atherstone who are the Lancastrians. There is a landmark there called the Bloody Bank as well, and on the same place, with some more 17th, 18th century maps. And in 1766, there was some exploration there, and they found some badges, some bones, a gilt spur engraved with white roses, and a key with the cipher RR, so Richard Rex. So it seems likely that this little sort of spat of some description had cracked off very close to the eventual battle site, just a day or two before. So we see these people arguing. On the 21st of August, Henry goes to confer with William and Thomas. So he's there, he's talking to them in the camp, right where the battle's going to crack off any minute now. And they're at Atherstone. And here they talked, they planned tactics. And really, if you think about it, although they were Thomas Stanley was his stepfather, they'd never met, they didn't know anything about each other, and him and Henry Tudor, they had to build a relationship at this point to go into this situation. So it's quite miraculous in a way. So Molinet and the Song of the Lady Bessie state, both of these state the location of the battle had already been decided. Thomas had been there for 3 days already, sort of checking it all out. He knew that Richard would have to come down an old Roman road, and we know this now as Fen Lane, which you can obviously still go down. And it was running parallel to a marshy, sort of flat, sticky, horrible plain with a ridge of high ground running parallel to it. So the ridge would limit the use of cavalry. Trying to get across marshland is always a nightmare. And so all of these things could reduce the effectiveness of Richard's artillery. So it was a great standpoint to have initially. Richard was still on the move. Stanley had been there 3 days earlier. So if they positioned themselves as the attacking force on high ground, that would control the road, and it would force Richard to fight at a disadvantage. So basically, They had been there long enough to work out and set a trap. So the Battle of Bosworth Field said Richard sent a message to William Stanley demanding that he join them for the battle. And William sent in the following reply: bid him array him with royalty and all the power that her may bring, for he shall either fight or flee or lose his life if he be king. So this was basically the 15th century equivalent of going, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. And that all sorts of, again, it's a trap, it's feeding in, it's making Richard come down, it's forcing him into this corner where they need to be. How are people at this point not thinking, oh, we don't know which way the Stanleys are going to go here? Because everybody else knew. So with their plan in place, it is quite likely that although they were the last to shift their arse once they got there, the Stanleys may very well have been first onto the area of the battlefield and took their positions. And there's different accounts, there's been different theories over the years, but we always hear about them being on high ground, don't we? Even if we don't know exactly where that high ground was or what the topography has changed from then till now. But so there is some disagreement on exactly where they were. But controlling the high ground, as I said, meant controlling the road and where everyone has to be. And when you're in battle, that is the advantage to end all advantages, isn't it? So the Stanleys seem to have been in two separate formations, with William at the head of one and Thomas at the head of the other. And anybody who knows much about this battle, it's really well documented, obviously, if you want to read up about this. At this point, Richard does seem to realise that the Stanleys probably weren't going to be reliable to fight in his corner. And he ordered that Lord Strange be executed if he was betrayed. And what was it? Richard looked up on the mountain high and said, I see the banner of Lord Stanley. Fetch hither the Lord Strange to me, for doubtless he shall die this day. So now we don't know exactly what happened to Lord Strange. He didn't get executed, but I don't know whether or not I heard that he'd escaped beforehand. Obviously, he didn't die, and then they just let him off because obviously he was on the winning side in the end, wasn't he? So, but he didn't get executed, so he didn't die that day. So that Richard got that wrong. There's also
wrong that day.
it didn't go well all round, really, did it? Another little myth, probable myth alert. Again, one of the things we don't know was that so Richard had gone into crown. This was he was wearing like St Edward's crown and blah blah blah. It probably wasn't. It was probably a coronet, because it would have stayed on his helmet more easily. It wasn't so valuable. But he'd gone into battle wearing this. Obviously, he got killed. His helmet was off, and so the coronet was gone as well. But I think it was one of the Stanleys. I think William Stanley found it, and it was supposed to be that Thomas placed the crown that Richard had worn onto Henry's head and said, I proclaim you king. So that's another little potential myth. Another potential myth is that when Thomas Stanley found out that Richard had Lord Strange and was threatening to kill him, he said, well, I have other sons. He could have said that. It seems a little bit unlikely that he'd have taken that sort of lax attitude about one of his heirs. But again, who knows? So potential little myths in the making. So really, my point after all this battle geekdom is, why did it genuinely take Richard that long to go, I think they're going to let me down here? Did it really take him that long it got to the crunch time and he was really thinking that they might still come in for him? And why did anybody else think that? I mean, I could understand that maybe they were just standing there and there might have been a bit of a point where Henry was a bit like, okay, this is squeaky bum time. Where the fuck are they? But did Richard really think all the Yorkist support was going to turn? Yeah, that weren't Yorkists. The support they'd given to the Yorkists in the past that had all been pulled. There was the bad blood. There was the stuff with the Harringtons. There was all of that. Did he suddenly think that the 11th hour they were going to turn that back round? Did he really think that threatening them and all this stuff was going to make them turn up and really fight for him on the day? I don't understand it. If anyone's got any ideas about that, did he think the threat was going to work? Was it blind hope that they would fight for him at the end of the day? I think everybody thought that Richard was going to win, so I don't know how worried he was about that. But the trap worked. Richard came in having a go because he did think he was hard enough and was forced to fight at a disadvantage. And we all know that he lost. Again, what happened at the battle is very well documented. We do obviously, as always, have to be a little bit careful when we're looking at who the sources are they were written for. It is unfortunate. I remember Mike Ingram telling me that the best sources were always the Welsh poetry, because whatever the outcome was, it was considered the height of dishonorability to write anything that was untrue or even ambiguous or anything like that within the Welsh poetry. So if you could get hold of some of those sources, they would be fantastic. But because it was Welsh poetry, no one seemed to care, and it's all gone missing. Or even if they were around, it would probably be there's a fairly good chance we wouldn't have been able to translate it at this stage. But apparently we reached a point where Richard is told to flee, to save himself, because it's getting a bit dicey, and he refuses and shouts, "This day I will die a king or win." And he was right. And at this point, he noticed that Tudor was isolated from the rest of his army, because obviously Henry was inexperienced in battle. So I don't quite remember how he'd got isolated from the rest of the army. And Richard knew that if he could get there, he believed if he could get to Henry like that, he could kill him, and then it would all be over. The battle would be over, Henry would be gone, the Lancastrians would truly be fucked at that point. There would literally be no coming back for that. So he gathered his cavalry and he launched a charge, and he came very, very, very close to victory, like so close. But of course, that moment is when William Stanley went, "All right, then, down he comes." And that's him on his horse, obviously. With about 3,000 men, and took them all into Richard's men. And it was unexpected. Henry Tudor's like, "Thank fuck for all of that." And we don't know, as you know, exactly how Richard died. There's a plethora of sort of wounds and things that we could tell from his bones. But that moment then saw the death of England's last Plantagenet king. So whilst we can see that in the earlier part of the Wars of the Roses, the Stanleys were seen as Yorkists. They fought for the Yorkist cause, literally. And occasionally they appeared like they might be on different sides, especially when we look at the evidence. I don't see how it has been passed down again and again and again that no one knew what the Stanleys were going to do until the last moment. I just don't get it. I don't understand. It could have been, I suppose, and why did they do it? It could have been the temptation on Thomas's part of being the king's stepfather. Maybe was looked pretty a bit of a cool place to be, but we will never know why they started to gravitate towards the Lancastrian cause. It could have been that they liked to hedge their bets over the course of the Civil War to see where things look better. It could have been something to do with the marriage to Margaret Beaufort. It could have been the discomfort instilled from all the stuff with the the Harringtons. So we don't know, but I don't understand why people said what Stanleys were going to do.
Well, do you think it's just going back to one of your like what you're saying there about they were Yorkists to begin with, and like, is that a bit of a myth that people had an allegiance, like as if to a football team, and they were never, it's really odd for them to switch sides? Like, it seems like a big assumption to me that a whole entire family have nailed their colours to the post and are not going to, regardless of how much else is changing, are not going to change their allegiance. And I just wonder whether that's an actual misnomer. Like, very
possibly, yeah, because we don't know what most people were doing, and then you also don't know what people were secretly thinking and plotting a lot of the time. The only thing I can think of is that obviously changing allegiance is an exceptionally risky business. So they had, the Earl of Oxford had some run-ins with Edward and stuff, and he ended up being a brilliant military man for the Lancastrians and the Tudors. The Oxfords did, but yeah, it was a risky business, and it wasn't just risky to you as the men that went into battle. It was for your wife and your children and your estates and all things like that. Because if you jumped ship and then it went tits up, you would lose absolutely everything. They'd probably cut your head off, and your wife and your children would get left destitute. And the best thing that could happen to your children would be that they would be wards of other noble families. But then look what happened to the wards of the Harrington family when they got taken on by the Stanleys. So I think the thing that might have prohibited people changing sides, perhaps as much as they'd like to, because they probably would have liked to sometimes, was just the fear of the consequences. But then you could just do things like not show up, pretend you've got the sweating sickness.
If you've got your troops there, like they're coming from their land, presumably. These are people who are in their service. So I'm just wondering as well how much of a I think I've read this somewhere. There's like a practical consideration as well. Like, oh, but how many of your, you know, the people you depend on to work your estates and make those profitable and productive, are you going to be willing to sacrifice in battle when, you know, it's kind of, you're there to support. It's that kind of, you're not. I think we talked about this before. Like, how much they really care.
If the king says to you, you have to array as many people as possible, then I guess whether it suits you or not, you have to array as many, because the king might see that if you've then got nobody left to plough the fields or whatever, and then your people are, you know, you're starving, the king might just go, depending on which king it is and how forward-thinking they are, well, that's a you problem.
Exactly. So they get to, so sometimes they get there and then they're holding off until, or don't get involved at all, because they've shown
there are other families
they've done what they're asked.
There are other families, of course, that are very reluctant to pop down, and like some of the Percys and stuff. And also, I suppose sometimes you're gathering mercenaries and things along the way, aren't you? And you've got people from other countries. So like, but Mike again argued that, you know, people say, oh, especially the anti-Henry people say, oh, well, the only people that were supporting him were the mercenaries. They didn't even believe in his cause. Well, actually, a lot of them were paid. He said, but they weren't mercenaries in the way they were described. They were paid. They were professional soldiers. They weren't just like the rough and tumble scrags off the street, you know. They were actually professional soldiers. So yes, maybe they didn't give a shit about whether or not Henry Tudor won, but they in the sense of, we give a shit about Henry Tudor, but they did give a shit about whether he won because they wanted to go home with a large pocket full of money and a good reputation. So they didn't like go, oh, it's Henry Tudor, we like him because it's Henry Tudor, but they did fight for the cause. So it's, you know, you can't force any of these people to cross the channel to fight for you. You can't force.
But someone's bankrolling him as well. Somebody has to be. Those mercenaries don't come cheap. So what it points to is that people are prepared to put their money where their mouth is. And when feudal nobles are ordered to provide men, that is part of their feudal duty. If they don't want to provide those men, the other option is they pay an enormous amount of cash so the king can get mercenaries. So essentially, it's like you either turn up with whatever people from your land you can, put down their pitchforks and their scythes and pick up weapons, or you keep them far in the fields and you pay me for the privilege of getting to stay home. So that's a thing that happens. And I think what you're saying about Stanley is that the family makes some sense, that throwing in your lot at this point with either side of this family, because they're all bloody related, throwing in your lot completely with either side makes very little sense. And I think that's the thing. When we talk about Yorkists and Lancastrians, it's very easy to forget that these people aren't blood related. Fairly closely blood related. And so essentially, why would somebody who's less closely blood related, but still no doubt, because the upper echelons of society are inbred, almost certainly has a claim to, I don't know, descent from Edward I, because every bugger does.
Everyone, yeah.
Every bugger. Why would they give a shit that these cousins are fighting when you're an eighth cousin? So you turn up when you absolutely have to. And when it comes to Bosworth, there's your son's held for ransom for your good behaviour. standing where you're standing, keeping an eye on what's going on, that makes sense, because you maybe protect your stepson, you protect your son, you could also potentially stop messengers from getting out and recount. That position allows you to control the outcome for your family in the best case scenario, not the outcome for England, the outcome for your family. But I do wonder where this myth of him as this kind of coin tossing, whose side am I going to come in on? When does this start to originate as well? Does it originate around the same time as we get Margaret Beaufort, religious zealot, scaling the tower with a dagger between her teeth to murder the princes? Is it all?
Can I just say as well, Stanley, if he fucked up,
she's a nutter and he's a turncoat.
I think probably, obviously, we see the stuff with the Harringtons where it starts to turn a little bit there, because that's the relationship with Richard III, not Edward. But of course, Richard III is who they end up with. And then I can't remember what battle it was now. Blore Heath, I think it was, where they were both there. William put his lot in for the Yorkists, but Stanley chose to hold back. Don't know why. He was there, but he didn't get involved. So, you know, you're sort of going into maybe a couple of decades before the Battle of Bosworth Field.
See, I'm just wondering,
get this, like, where
I'm wondering
whether or not they had it at the time posthumously. That's where people have perhaps started to say this is what the Stanleys were like.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if that myth of like the Stanleys at Bosworth, that Richard is expecting them, that Richard has faith that they're going to turn up to his side, that they are let down, that they let Richard down. And also, conversely, that there is some suggestion that Margaret didn't know that they were going to defend or come down on the side of her son Henry. That plays into part of that myth and narrative about who Margaret Beaufort is. And the kind of that she makes this politically scheming marriage, that she's always a Lancastrian. And so she marries somebody who's also prepared to kind of sit both sides of the fence, because that gives her protection, because the last thing she wants is him trying to knock her up. And that they have this secret deal between the two of them. And all of this kind of stuff, the Stanleys and Margaret Beaufort as crazed schemers, turncoats, zealots, whatever it may be, that feels like a much later narrative. It's interesting. It's interesting that Stanley's sweating sickness. That's interesting, because all of the other accounts say that sweating sickness turns up with Henry's army going to Bosworth. So that's also odd.
Well,
the Stanley element of it as well takes it's like a blame, isn't it? It can't be Richard's failure, because actually it was due to the Stanleys
tricking him.
Yeah, they're what's the word?
Tricky. They tricked him.
Well, tricky, but like
but they didn't. Well, this is the thing. This is where does the myth lie? The myth lies that they tricked him. They made him think they might show up for him on the day.
Yeah.
But what I've gone through sends the message quite clearly to Richard that he shouldn't. That faith is misplaced.
Yeah, but that myth helps to sort of let Richard off the hook a bit.
Yeah. But it is that is it does, because it's a nice. That there's a certain group of people who don't like the Stanleys very much and get very cross about them, and then like to say, well, Henry only won because of the Stanleys. Well, you know, maybe he did, but at the end of the day, he still won. That's what
betrayal. That's the word I was looking for.
That's what
the Stanleys betray him.
Yeah.
So you know, he couldn't possibly have known it was coming because it's a proper betrayal. It just seems to let.
I think the relationship with Richard and the Stanleys had been tenuous for quite a long time, but it didn't matter when Edward was king. And they were still loyal to Edward V initially. And then, of course, Edward V disappears from the equation. So I don't think we know what this, as we know, you know, a lot of people will say, even a lot of Ricardians will say, a lot of the people that turned against Richard and helped you to get victory were Yorkists. It's just that they were furious.
I don't. If you
So
imagine
it's
that,
like, what did they think about how Richard took the throne? Was that part of the Stanley's thought process? It was like, you know, actually, no, we don't agree with this, and we can't support Richard. Now, we were prepared to support Edward V, but we can't support Richard because this has happened, and we believe that he did away with them or whatever, but we don't know. If you
imagine that scenario now, right? If you're loyal to Edward, and he has a son, and clearly Edward there's no question during Edward's lifetime that his sons are not legitimate, and therefore there's a set line of succession. If you're loyal to Edward, just because the guy who takes the throne in place of Edward's son is Edward's brother, I actually don't. That to me seems like a recipe for you absolutely not supporting Richard. So if can you imagine being in that, I don't know, a much lower stakes game of that now, if you knew someone and they basically, like, families split over stuff all the time.
They really do. Yeah.
It's never come back together.
What is the equivalent of it's the equivalent of your friend, maybe your boss, but let's say your friend passing away at a very young age with a wife and 2 young children. And he leaves, obviously, his house, his estate, all of that to his children to be looked after. But he lets his brother be the executor so that his wife can have a share. And then his brother steps in and goes, actually, I'm going to take this all in trust so the boys can't access it till they're 25. And so she's going to get a job and support them, not in the style they've become accustomed to. The house is in trust now. Imagine if a friend of yours, that happens to their family, you'd be absolutely gunning for the brother.
Yeah, this is why I don't really understand why, like, so the label Yorkist and Lancashire, it's almost like it's redundant by this point, isn't it? And like, yeah, I don't see why, if you supported Edward, it sounds like easy peasy to say, so Richard, like, it would be really difficult to then support Richard, actually.
I'd have thought so, yeah, but...
And naturally, then you go back up the tree and go, okay, so who's left of the Lancastrians? And they've effectively whittled down the potential pool.
Massively.
And they've left themselves with one solitary challenger, Henry. If they'd left some more people alive on the Lancastrian side, there may have been more of a question. But the Yorkists effectively did half the job for Henry by bloody killing everybody.
Yeah,
so they did. Buckingham a contender at one point, that initial rebellion, and then he gets killed, doesn't he?
Because of his blood.
Was he?
Yeah, he's got a good claim, and he thinks he can get them support because he can say, I have a legitimate claim for sure because of my bloodline. Whereas you could argue that Edward didn't because he was a usurper. It looks like Richard's a complete bastard, so you don't want him there. So, you know, but
Nathan covers this, doesn't he? In his book.
And then, of course, the next in Henry VIII's reign, the next Buckingham.
Yeah.
It's a passenger
great name. Not a great
No, the Staffords
it's not a safe place.
Don't do well. No, Staffords aren't doing a good job.
You think that there's no learning curve, is there, from father to son?
No.
But yeah, I think.
Well, that's that was really interesting because I know, and that skirmish 2 days before Bosworth, I did no idea about that. I didn't realise the Stanleys had been there for that, you know, and sort of bedded in that long before.
And yeah, maybe they were sitting there thinking, well, it looks like we're dating this great setup, but it does give us the opportunity to fuck off the other way. You know, why didn't they plough in straight away? Well, it's a good point. Like you say, Kat, I'm thinking, well, you know, we could just leave this and then go later. Well, we thought you were going to win on your own. So I didn't want to leave your mum a widow again, bless her. Because I wouldn't want to go home to Margaret Beaufort and go, fuck this up, because she'd kill you.
Kind of makes sense anyway, doesn't it? I mean, other battles have done that. They don't send everyone in at the same from the beginning, from the get-go.
Yeah, and then it's like a chance to see where they need to be the most, where they're going to be the most, because William Stanley committed and Thomas didn't. So he's still maybe assessing what's going to happen if you send this lot in. But then Thomas didn't take part of Blore Heath. He just stood and watched. So,
but also maybe it's about making sure that you can pull the other one out, or whoever you need to. If you're on the sidelines, if it's all going tits up, you become the escape party. You have spare horses, and you get that person away. Because medieval warfare has changed. It used to be a case that you'd ransom your enemies back. Now they just fucking kill them.
Yeah.
The rules of engagement are different. So you need an escape party that you can really trust. And in the case of Henry VII, future Henry VII, your mum's husband.
I mean, there was supposed to have been a time. I didn't come across anything while I was just researching for this, but I'm sure I've come across stuff in the past, which goes from this, they're going from one side to the next, to the next, to the next. One of the reasons that they would sometimes try and straddle the two is because then one of them could go, oh, look, I know my brother was a bit of a dick siding with them, but, you know, and as the elder one, his word perhaps would have had more sway if William had gone in and then Richard had won, gone, oh, sorry, bit of a dick. Tried to hold him back, you know what kids are like, even though he wasn't a kid, and you know, and kind of gone.
I can totally see that as a strategy. Yeah,
but the difference. So, I mean, after all, that's what he does. That's what Stanley does for Margaret. She does some stuff that they're like, "You're a fucking traitor," and he's like, "The wife, the wife."
Oh look, I'll lock her up. She'll be fine.
Oh, don't worry. I'll look after all her money. You haven't got. She is a traitor. But as she is a little lady brain, don't worry. The money doesn't go back to the crown. Money comes to Stanley.
Yeah.
And, you know, and until you see Henry VII learn from the Wars of the Roses and he revives the Star Chamber to stop the nobles getting so much money, and therefore to stop them having more power than the monarch. You know, Richard of York had more power than Henry VI. And so did a lot of the nobles and previous monarchs. You know, by, you know, Stanley with a lot of money is dangerous. So, you know, by grabbing hold of everything that Margaret Beaufort's got, it is a very political move. It's a very wise move. Maybe Margaret did choose it for protection. She saw his position. She saw that she was going to have to be forced into a Yorkist corner, and he still had good grace with Edward. I don't. All these things are conjecture, like most of things, really. But yeah, it makes sense to hedge your bets if you can. And I'm not saying that obviously that they never did that, because if they were wise, they probably tried. But
yeah,
when it comes down to it, to say that even Richard and Henry didn't have any suspicion what was going to happen until that last second, just seems really quite ridiculous.
It seems it makes for a good story.
It does, you see, that element of surprise, the elephant of surprise.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I love that. That the elephant of surprise.
Surprise. So yeah, so that certainly
really
people hate the Stanleys, and you know, if William hadn't marched down the hill with his 3,000 men, who knows, probably Richard might have won. But it is what it is. That's what happened. Yeah. So, rightly or wrongly, despite what people want to happen, it's not going to. They'll have to find a way to move into a parallel universe where it did.
Or live with it.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen, though, is it?
No. keep trying to rewrite history.
Yeah.
There we are.
Keep going.
Right.
You'll get there in the end.
So,
right. So, Philippa, just tell us something about next week.
Well, next week we are live.
History.
Are we on a Tuesday next time? It's the 12th anyway of August.
Yes, we are. It is, yes. Tuesday the 12th.
Tuesday. Just to confuse you all. Instead of our normal Wednesday slot, it's a Tuesday, same time. And we will be here live. We will let you know the detail of what that will be entailing nearer to the day.
So hold on to your butts.
Yeah. Yes. Put it in the diary though. Definitely join.
Yes.
It'll be worth your time.
And also make sure that you have liked this video, shared this video, commented on this video. Make the algorithm goblins happy. Also hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button, and that way allegedly you'll be told when we're next uploading. if you like what you see here, and of course you do, because you keep coming back, you can show us with money.
Oh,
In the right order this time. I'm in the right order this time. That's www.buymeacoffee.com/hadpodcast. You can show your admiration with cash. And that is also where you can join our close friends on the Hinstagram. That's where you have the little logo that has a light of green around it. That means you're a close friend. And that's where Catherine goes out into the internet, the ether of the internet, and she mines for disgusting things. And she puts them up for us and we all laugh. And that's also what our group chat looks like. Instagram is also a great place because we do, if YouTube lets you down on announcing what's happening, the Instagram will tell you. The other place that you can come is if you come over to our Substack, that is historyafterdarkhub.substack.com. There you will find out what we're doing. It will be shared there. You can also check out our merch, links to our merch, like our Warboner merch, our History After Dark merch, our Timmy is a Problem merch, etc., etc., etc. That's where you can come for that. It's also a place where you can pick up us as a podcast. Now, if you go on to the podcast, of course, there's no subscribe, there's no likes. But what you can do is you can give us a 5-star review and tell everybody on that place how fabulous you think we are. If you don't think we're worth 5 stars, quiet, just go limp. It's okay. Shh, it's fine. You'll give in eventually. That was weird, wasn't it? That was weird.
You know, you want to.
Yeah, go on, give in. So that's it. We've done merch, we've done Substack, we've done anything else. Oh, links in the description box to our other social medias as History After Dark, but also as our individual social medias as ourselves, where we are less vulgar. Come and check them all out, pals. That's it, isn't it?
That's it.
Yeah, I think so.
Right. In which
Until
case,
live.
Until then, be good. And if you can't be good, be careful. And if you can't be careful, just do not get caught. We're going to leave in 3, 2, 1. Bye.